Hey everyone, it's Ardith for ellenhudson.com with Innovations with Ardith for April. Last month's Essential by Ellen release included a bunch of essential shape die sets that have me indulging my love for geometric design, and I've been playing all month long to make projects for this video. Here are a few cards I've made this month using the essential circles and squares. I have a few variations on the same theme, which is a grid of squares with circles on top. This one's a 5x5 grid, and I love the mix of colors and shapes, but of course that was a lot of die cutting. I also tried a 2x2 grid, and I used the smallest essential rectangle with its matching frame for all my sentiments. The third card was one circle and square with ink blending, and finally I made one that used some of the frames that I was cutting with each of the squares and circles. When you buy the Essential Shapes dies, they come with 2 sheets of nesting dies that cut the shape as well as a narrow frame. Here are the ovals. If you haven't seen how Julie used these to create rainbows, be sure to check it out. Such a clever idea. I've been working on storing all these dies, especially the rectangles, squares, and circles, because I use them the most. Sometimes I find having 2 sheets of these dies in one of the plastic pockets, it can be awkward, especially when you're trying to reach for one of the smaller dies in the center and when you're trying to get them back into the pocket. So for my circles, I've been keeping them organized with a simple binder ring. I don't worry about keeping them in order. I just search for the one I want, open the ring carefully, and pull it out. This seems to be working well. I've had them like this since I got them, and I even put my old circles without frames on another ring, so I can easily tell them apart. Since I use the circles quite a bit, I keep both sets in a little square box in a drawer close to my Gemini Junior. This binder ring idea will likely work for the squares and rectangles too, but right before this video, I got out some old DVD cases and I put magnet sheets on each side. I used Be Creative tape to hold the magnet sheets in the box, and then I loaded them up with the dies. I am a little concerned that the magnets are very close to each other, and that the dies might try to jump from one side to the other when they're closed up or opened, so for the rectangles I tried offsetting the magnets in the case a little. As I said, this is brand new for me. I'm not sure if it's going to work, or if I'll like it, but I'll let you know how it goes. Another set in the release was the Hex Frames, which only has the 2 dies, but since they also have frames, I've included this set in one of my cards. Okay, so let's get started. My first card will be another grid that works with the set I showed you earlier, so you can get a sense of how I put them all together. I've already die cut 16 squares, so this one will be a 4x4 grid. I'm using the same 5 ink colors: Queen for a Day, Eucalyptus, Rouge, Sauna, and Juniper Mist, all from Catherine Pooler. I'm using a direct paper method. I simply pat the shape down into the ink pad and then press down on one side, which pushes up the other for me to pick it up. If your ink pads are juicy, these colors are pretty intense to start, but they do lighten up as they dry. A couple of tips for direct to paper. I'm using the wells on my Waffle Flower water media mat to keep track of the shapes and to keep them separated from each other as they dry. Also, it's important to keep your hands as clean as possible so you don't contaminate your shapes with a previous color. When your ink pads aren't juicy, then you get something more like this, which I think is okay. It's kind of a distressed look, and it works with these rich colors by adding a bit of texture. Once all the squares were done, I thought about trying to achieve a similar look of my 5x5 card without having to die cut 16 circles, and I came up with 2 ideas. First, I used some Post-it tape and I masked some of the squares corner to corner diagonally, and I blended more ink onto the exposed portion using a sponge dauber. These inks layer up really well and give a good contrast. For some variation, I took a page from my friend Carly's book and I created a little stencil or mask from some acetate and one of the smallest essential circles dies, and then I just blended the ink through that. So I did some of each method for each color so that I would have a good mix when it came time to put the grid together. Once I had all the squares done, I futzed around a bit to figure out how to put them together on a grid. I wanted to try having the squares diagonally this time, and I worked to try and put them so that there was a good mix of colors and patterns. And would you look at that, I just ended up with a square grid tilted on its corner. Honestly, sometimes when I'm creating, my basic math skills seem to desert me. Anyway, once I was happy with it, I cut a square piece of white cardstock and I coated it with adhesive to be my backer for the grid. I put my white cardstock in the corner of my water media mat, and this will help me line up these squares properly. I started in the bottom right corner, and I worked up each row, making sure that each little square was pushed right up against the ones next to it. And here's how I ended up going diagonal. I cut a piece of black cardstock to a 4 1/4 inch square, and then I lined up my colorful panel so that the 4 little squares that went over the edge all had exactly half of the square extending out. That way I knew everything was centered and equal. See, sometimes the math does stay in my head. When I had it all pressed down in place, I trimmed off the excess. For my sentiment, I used the smallest essential rectangle die, and I cut the rectangle from white and the frame from black. The sentiments in the Modern Succulent set fit well on these little improvised sentiment strips, and I'm going to use Take Good Care. I seem to be sending a lot of these types of cards in these days of physical distancing. You could use your Misty, but I took a risk and I used an acrylic block and VersaFine Onyx ink. To easily put the frame and rectangle together, here's what I do. I cut a piece of foam tape to about the length of the frame, and then I trim a bit off so that it's the correct width as well. I put the rectangle sentiment face down inside the frame, which is also face down, and then I cut the foam tape in half and carefully place one piece on each end so that both the rectangle and the frame are covered with the foam tape. If the center has a little space between the two pieces of foam tape, that's okay. It's more important to get the edges covered. Then I just decided on placement and I stuck it down. Here's the rest of the card set, and you can see that this one fits right in. Or does it? I really wish that I had a bit more white on the card. So I took a white frame from a rectangle die cut and a 2-way glue pen. I snipped the frame and put some glue down along the edges of my colored panel, then simply held the piece of frame in place before moving to the next side. When all 4 sides were dry, I used scissors to trim off the excess bits. These colors are rich and vibrant and perfect for a set of masculine cards. Some of my sentiments are from Life is a Circus as well. I really wanted little sentiments that wouldn't cover up all the work on my backgrounds. For my next card, I'm going to work with a different color palette and one of the hexes. I've cut 8 of these as well as a panel of white cardstock using one of the Essential Rectangles dies, and I'm just placing them down here to get a sense of my layout. I know I want my sentiment in the center hex, and this Hey Friend from It's All Good will fit perfectly. I used my Misty to stamp it with amalgam ink because I'll likely color in those outline letters so they'll have more impact. Next, I'm going to use the rustic wood grain background stamp on one of the hexes to create some black and white stripes. I used repositionable adhesive on the back of the hex since I won't be able to use a magnet, and I may need to stamp it more than once. When I can't use a magnet, I try to remember where I've placed the cardstock in case it lifts up with the stamp when I stamp it down, which happens a lot. Isn't it funny how when you use this stamp with black and white, you get a bit of a zebra vibe? Next, I colored the rest of my hexes again with Catherine Pooler ink and a slightly different direct-to-paper method. Because these shapes are bigger, it's easier to put the hex down on the mat and then press the ink pad onto it. I did this with Lime Ricky, Tiki Torch, Samba, Mardi Gras, and Be Mine ink. To assemble my panel, I worked on the grid of my work surface. I'm lazy when it comes to measuring, but it's easy to center the panel and then figure out how to place the sentiment hex, and once that's in place, it's easy to go from there. In the previous set of cards, I put the squares in my grids right up to each other. But for this one, I want to space out the bold, colorful hexes so there's still some white showing in between. I found that the easiest way to do this was to use 2 frames, one around the sentiment hex and one around the next one I'm trying to place. This way, the space between all the hexes will be even and regular. At the end, I needed an extra little bit, so I trimmed off part of the red hex and I placed it in at the bottom. Then I trimmed off all the extra bits. Now you may have already guessed where this is going, but now I'm coloring this adorable zebra from Life is a Circus, just with some warm gray for shading and a little pink for his ears. Then I popped him up and colored in the Hey sentiment with a black marker. I put the panel onto a black mat and a white card base. I love the balance between the zebra and the stripes I created on the hexagon with the wood grain stamp. For my final card, I cut 10 of the smallest rectangles from black cardstock and a white panel with another rectangle. I started by stacking up the black rectangles so that I had 5. I want them to have a little dimension. Now, placement on this card is going to be everything. I'm trying to create a piano keyboard. This is a great, simple design for a card for a musician or music teacher. So I went back to the grid on my work surface to help me be sure that I had the black keys spaced properly and the whole pattern spaced properly on the white panel. For my sentiment, I used the thank you from Mondo Succulents in my Mini Misty. I couldn't find my VersaFine on my desk, so I used the amalgam ink, which also gave a very crisp impression. To add a bit of color to the card, I grabbed the frame from the white panel and a rainbow of Copic markers, and I just blended them around the whole thing. Then I used that same method with the foam tape to attach the frame to the rectangle, and I popped it up on a white card base. I hope you enjoyed this video. Basic shapes are a must in any craft room, and these ones with the added frame feature are a nice twist on a classic. Even as I watch this video, my mind is racing with more ways to use them in my card making. Product links are below and also on the blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.